are forced to mix medical waste with organic waste. This poses a health risk for humans, for workers, and it's also a threat to groundwater.
Waste management workers say they're seeking money for a new incineration plant. But with Yemen facing billions of dollars in funding shortfall after 7 years of war, many worry this issue will be pushed to the back burner. Laura Bowden-Manley, Al Jazeera.
Hello again, this is Al Jazeera and these are the headlines. At least 3 people have been killed in a shooting at a shopping mall near the Danish capital. Many others were also injured. Police say a 22-year-old Danish man has been arrested. Paul Rees is in.
Police saying they're certainly not ruling out terrorism, but they haven't decided on a motive as yet. They have said they've arrested a 22-year-old, what the police chief earlier described as an ethnic Dane, in the vicinity of the Fields shopping mall. Witnesses described him walking around shooting people with what those witnesses described as a hunting rifle.
Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has vowed the military will regain control of the city of Lysychansk. Ukrainian forces withdrew after a Russian advance. It was the government's last stronghold in the eastern province of Luhansk. The West African bloc, ECOWAS, has lifted economic sanctions against Mali, imposed in response to a series of military coups. Leaders from the bloc are holding talks with respect to Mali, Guinea and Burkina Faso. Palestinian leaders say U.S. officials have handed back the bullet that killed Al Jazeera journalist Shireen Abu Akleh after examining it. Earlier, the Israeli military had said that it would test the bullet with U.S. oversight, but it's still not clear if that's actually what's happened. Palestinian leaders say the bullet was given to the United States with assurances that Israel would not be involved. Shireen was killed by Israeli soldiers back in May while reporting on raids in the occupied West Bank. Well, those are the headlines. I'll have much more news for you here on Al Jazeera after the stream. Do remember, you can always check out aljazeera.com.
Meteorites. Small natural rocks from outer space survive the journey down to Earth and have high market value for rock and mineral collectors. Our world joins the Moroccan nomads in their desert search for these gifts from the sky.
I can tell that it's a meteoroid. It is a meteoroid.
Morocco's meteorite hunters on Al Jazeera.
Hi, I'm Ahmed Shahabuddin, filling in for Femi Oke. Each month in the U.S., an average of 57 women are shot and killed by an intimate partner. In many of those cases, women are being killed by partners who are legally barred from even having a gun in the first place. Today on the stream, we discuss why so many domestic abusers have access to guns and what can be done to stop these illegal murders. Take a look at the trailer for a new documentary from Fault Lines, which investigates how U.S. gun laws are failing to prevent domestic abusers from killing their partners.
Check on my daughter, Jasmine Willock. I just did a check on her. She didn't go to work the last 2 days. The guy she's with is going to court for beating her, so I don't know if she's alive or not.
I can't leave. I feel like I'm being pushed and pulled. I don't know what to do now.
He would isolate her, keep her away from us. She had marks on her neck, marks on her arms. Her back was all tore up. The sleeve was tore off.
Do you think I should pistol whip you? I'm just saying, please stop, please stop.
The investigator knew the police knew he had a gun.
The bullet had went in the back of my head and came out my cheek.
All these laws that are out here, and my daughter.
Laws and books that are just for show.
We punish them on the back end, and by that time, it's often too late.
It just makes you believe that the system did nothing to help.
A warning to our viewers, the conversation today will focus on domestic violence and maybe keep it out to some audiences. Joining us today, we have Fault Lines correspondent and investigative reporter of Reveal, Jennifer Close. Texas, we're joined by Natalie Massey, director of the Legal Center for Victims of Crimes Against Women. And in Baltimore, Maryland, is Shannon Frateroli, a professor at the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School. As always, we want to hear your thoughts and questions, so be sure to jump into our live YouTube chat, and you too can be part of this discussion. Ladies, thank you so much for joining us. Such an important film, really stunning, really powerful, moved me to want to understand this more and even do something about it, quite frankly. And I want to ask you, I mean, Jasmine's story, a harrowing example of kind of tragic outcomes that could be prevented. And I'm curious what you discovered, what you learned, and why you made this film.
We learned that Jasmine's story demonstrates what's happening across the U.S., and that is that offenders who should not have guns under federal and some state laws are still carrying them anyway, and they're using them to kill their intimate partners at alarming rates. The number of intimate partners killed over the last 10 years is soaring, and we know that the problem has been compounded by the reason we made this film is because we were driven by this sense of utter injustice, that mostly women are dying at the hands of people who should not have guns, and the laws not being well enforced.
And I see both you ladies are nodding. I want to go very quickly to a comment that came in from our community. Someone named April, who I believe know, who's kind of framing the debate in a very interesting way.
In the United States, 3.4% of non-fatal domestic violence events include the use of a gun. That amounts to 32,900 non-fatal gun events a year. And the majority of intimate partner homicides are committed with a gun. What we need to do to protect intimate partners who are abused is make sure that their violent partners don't have access to a gun. We have laws in the United States that say that intimate partner abusers can't purchase or possess a gun. But those laws need to be implemented. Particularly when somebody already possesses a gun, those guns need to be relinquished.
Natalie, how widespread is this? Is it growing? We heard Jennifer say the pandemic, things are getting worse, understandably. Why is this happening?
Well, it's difficult really to know exactly how widespread it is, because I think one of the things the documentary shows so nicely is that we're not collecting data on these issues. In fact, one of the things that's so remarkable about this reporting is that she's the first person to really uncover this connection between guns not being taken away, as the law says they should be, and the ensuing fatalities that are happening to women and the harm that's happening to families. And so I presume it came as a shock to a lot of your viewers that the federal government isn't doing tracking on this issue. And unfortunately, that's something really common in this area of firearms here in the United States.
Right, and Shannon, that's why I used the word stunned. I mean, the film is stunning. I was stunned. Maybe the audience might also be stunned to learn that the federal government isn't doing that. I do want to ask you, this is not just impacting, of course, these victims who are being abused or being attacked or who are being murdered, of course. It also has bigger implications, right? It has implications for the family. Could you outline for us what the scale is truly of this?
Right, so we rightfully often focus on the people who are experiencing the abuse directly, right? So in the case, the scenarios that are presented, the women who are abused. But if you think about the context in which this abuse is happening, it's happening in homes, it's happening in communities, and there are children who are witnessing this abuse. There are children who are looking at their parents interacting in this way. So this kind of abuse, this kind of violence has ripple effects and ramifications for generations to come. This is what children are learning as they're growing up in their homes, and it's something that is far more common and far more damaging than I think most of us understand or admit.
The film brilliantly illustrates that. It's a short film, but you really do get into that from various angles. I want to take a quick look at this clip and come back to you on the other side of it. Take a look.
I feel like a lot of people don't see how big an issue it really is. They don't see the ripple effect from it.
After Ashley's death, her son moved to another state to live with his dad. Lisa hasn't seen her nephew in several years. And her son hasn't been the same since the shooting.
He's withdrawn. He used to be just open and different. He always tells me how much he misses my sister and my nephew. I'm worried that it will stick with him forever. You know, they say children are resilient, but they're not supposed to see that. They're not supposed to go through that.
See that back. What can you show us about this that kind of humanizes what happens to a whole family and community when this occurs?
Her son, who so eloquently described there, has never been the same. He plays video games during the day. It's affected her entire family, and she hasn't seen her nephew for years. And that was the son, her nephew, who was orphaned after his mother was killed. And we know that there are untold number of kids and families who have been split apart and devastated by these shootings.
And so much devastation, and it's hard to measure, as we've heard. I'm curious, when you see that, you know, when we talk about this being a problem of enforcement, what would you suggest should be the priority in terms of trying to address this?
Yes, well, this clip really demonstrates, you know, one of the challenges we have in our society. Because on the one hand, we have over the past few decades gone a long way toward passing laws to address these very problems. We've gone a long way toward passing laws that allow for courts to temporarily remove guns when domestic violence is an issue through civil protection orders. What we haven't done is follow up to assure that those laws are implemented and enforced. And we need to be focusing attention on not just passing laws, but making sure that the systems are in place and supported so that the benefits from those laws can be realized, and that people that are featured in videos like this don't experience the violence that is so devastating to families and communities.
And Natalie, you know, when we talk about these laws and the loopholes, and where are things falling apart, and how can this continue to not get the attention that the documentary is really shining on it?
Yeah, I mean, there are a number of issues that cause this to be really complicated. The first is that we have a system here in the United States where we have a federal system where we have laws on the books on the federal level across the country domestic violence offenders from possessing firearms after they've been convicted. The issue is that the enforcement really needs to happen at the state level, and the underlying convictions are also at the state level. So at baseline, you have this really challenging interplay between laws that are in two different places, right, at the federal level and the state level. And so that's the first big hurdle.
Right. And when we say that that's just the first hurdle, Jennifer, I want to in a moment show a clip from the film where you actually kind of pressure the acting deputy director of the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, which is responsible essentially for potentially collecting and gathering that data, right? Or could be. And I think it's important because it really does show that this is a sort of failure in accountability. Take a look at this.
How many people are prohibited from having guns because of felony convictions and qualifying domestic violence misdemeanors?
I don't know that number. I'm not sure anyone knows that solution.
And how many domestic violence homicides are being committed by people who are not allowed to have guns?
I don't have that number.
People have died at the hands of partners who were prohibited possessors, and we don't know how many prohibited possessors are out there.
We certainly track the number of firearms that we seize, but our mission is focused on investigating violations of federal laws and not following up on local convictions.
Nice shot. I kept I just feel it's instinctive. You see that, you think it's obvious almost. So is this a process issue? Is this a funding issue?
I think all of those are good questions. For our newsroom, it wasn't a funding issue. It's more driven by a sense of justice here. And we need the data to be able to create informed policy decisions. And we know that from our research, from our little newsroom, that more than 100 people have died at the hands of people who should not have had guns under federal and/or state laws. And they still went on to kill their partners. So it's possible. The data collection is doable. I've done it. And we gathered the data from more than 20 states, ran criminal background checks on hundreds of domestic violence homicide perpetrators, and then gathered all the court records to vet the cases to see who met the federal criteria for being prohibited. So we've done it, and it's doable.
So then it's a lack of will. I mean, you say we've done it, it's doable, and I would imagine your resources don't outnumber the resources of local or federal government. I'm wondering, Shannon, forgive me, I'm just going to pivot for a second because it seems obvious. Without data, you can't even understand necessarily a problem, let alone solve it. So I'm curious, where do you think there needs to be a focus to actually start to have other people do the work that Jennifer and her team have done?
Well, so the good news is that so I've looked around the country to try to look at local jurisdictions and identify those that have really stepped up and done the kind of enforcement work that we're talking about here. They're hard to find, but they do exist. And when you do find those local jurisdictions who are doing this work, who are following up on civil domestic violence protection orders, what you find are law enforcement units that are trained, that are committed, that understand the problem of domestic violence, that understand the real risk that firearms pose, and are committed to making sure that when a court issues a protection order that says you are temporarily prohibited from purchasing and possessing guns, that law enforcement unit is committed to doing everything that they can to assure that the respondent to that order is not possessing guns while that order is in place. We've seen it happen. It's a small number of jurisdictions, as far as I can tell, that are doing this work, but they are out there, and it does work, and it does make a difference.
It looks like you wanted to jump in there.
Yeah, well, and I think what's important to remember too is the reason that Shannon is having a hard time finding jurisdictions where this is working is first because half of the states in this country actually have laws on their books that are similar to the federal statutes that prohibit domestic violence offenders from having firearms, right? So if a state doesn't even have the laws on the books, it's going to be hard to get momentum around enforcing them. The other piece is that coordination has to happen very deliberately, right? You're thinking about a process where you have a police department, a prosecutor's office, a judge, a probation officer, all of these different areas of the criminal justice system who have to be involved in this enforcement process and getting those people on the same page, getting the local government entities to fund those agencies to do this work specifically. Like we saw, the ATF doesn't have a dedicated domestic violence task force. And so it can be done. It absolutely can be done, but it takes prioritizing this issue.
So it can be done. We have heard from Shannon examples where things are working. So there is some hope here. And we have a comment from Ernest Coverson from the End Gun Violence campaign manager. He's with Amnesty International. He kind of echoes some of what you discussed. Take a listen.
What would it take to end gun violence in the United States? Two things. One, funding community-based organizations that's doing great work in this country, doing great work in communities across this country. They are changing lives on a day-to-day basis. Funding many times isn't there. So for the federal government to actually fund these organizations so they can continue to do the work, and the political will of of our elected officials to enact common sense legislation that will allow guns to be tracked, guns to be registered, gun owners to take responsibility for their firearm. These are two opportunities that we have that would change this epidemic.
You're nodding. I was going to go to Natalie, but it seems like you either agree with a lot of what you outlined. Four things. What do you make of that?
I completely agree. I mean, we need sort of voices in this country to recognize the problem and the opportunity we have to address this problem and hold people accountable. We need citizens, we need stakeholders and advocates to really elevate this problem and point towards solutions. What takes movement in our communities is people caring and people raising their voices together to call for action, to call for attention to the problems that we care about. And the sad fact of the matter is that for decades, domestic violence just has not been a priority in this country. We've been willing to sort of dismiss it, to sweep it under the rug, to classify it as a family problem. We're only now starting to really come to terms with it, and we need lots of loud voices in order to assure that we deal with it effectively and address the guns that are also devastating in these relations.
Did you have something else?
Yes, I mean, part of the problem in this country is there's no gun registry. Federal law prohibits it. So it's very difficult to track who owns which guns and how many they have, including prohibited offenders who are barred from having firearms. The other issue is that our country is awash in guns, and for private gun transfers, there's no requirement that people undergo a background check.
And you talk about the background check, the U.S. being awash with guns, I should say. We have a Twitter comment from Tendai talking about the culture of guns, if you will. If truth be told, the horse has already bolted in the U.S. as far as gun violence is concerned. As long as Americans continue to glorify guns and violence in their movies and entertainment, as well as believing that guns are a necessary tool for protection, then it's a lost cause. So quite pessimistic there, Shannon, but I'm curious, the culture itself, how big a role does that play? We know that it's the Second Amendment. We know that we hear Americans love their guns, and there are statistics to back, as we've heard in the dog. Why? Does that have to be part of a solution? Can we change this reality without a big shift?
I don't think we need to change the culture. The culture is there, but there's also another culture that recognizes that responsibility when it comes to gun ownership is key. There's another culture that doesn't want to be gun owners. In fact, when we do polls, and we've done many polls about public opinion about gun policy, what we see, I'm guessing, would shock the viewers here today. We see consistently over time overwhelming support, large majorities of support for common sense gun violence prevention policies, like policies that prohibit respondents to civil domestic violence protection orders from purchasing and possessing guns. And regardless of how we cut the data, if we look at men or women or Republicans or Democrats, different ages, gun owners, gun owners, people who identify with the NRA, what we consistently see is common sense gun policy makes sense to most voters. But those voices aren't what rises when we have policy discussions. What rises are a minority of extreme views with regard to what our culture is about. Gun culture is a part of what we are in America, but it's a small part, and there are many other voices that.
And Natalie, I know you wanted to jump in. I want to ask you though. The three proposed rounds of legislation. Why did they fail? I mean, where is the optimism that new efforts might succeed?
Yeah, I mean, I think Shannon is right that I think this legislation fails because a small group of individuals has an outsized control on the policy making in this country. Look, I have to say, I don't know that I am incredibly optimistic about solutions at the federal level, given our political climate, which is why I think we need to be focusing our energy on the state level. As I said, passing these laws in states where we have them and working community by community to enforce the laws that we have on the books. I think that can be done. We can we can change culture. I think what Ernest was saying, it's got to be a community-based effort, and we can start to change minds around that.
Speaking about community, we also have someone in our broader community here at the street, the director of the National Research on Domestic Violence and Firearms, who has a message for our audience that he sent us via video. Take a listen.
If you're concerned, having heard about firearms and firearms not being taken from domestic abusers, there are some things that we think you can do. You can find out in your own community if the court is, first of all, advising defendants or warning them that they can't purchase a gun or possess a gun. Secondly, you should be finding out if that person has firearms or has access to firearms. Next, the court should be ordering that person to surrender the firearms. Finally, the court should be holding some type of hearing or otherwise ensuring that the person has complied. Unless all four of those steps are being taken in your community, you may be living in a community that relies on the honor system, where you're expecting the person who is prohibited from possessing guns to turn them involuntarily. And that's a very dangerous thing.
The honor system reality is quite surprising for someone who didn't know anything about it. He outlines some concrete steps, 4 steps. Anything you want to add based on your work that you think you would recommend should be addressed?
I suppose too. I mean, I think that's one of the shocking things is that it's an open secret among judges, lawyers, prosecutors, police, that we're operating on this honor system. And we're trusting offenders who have already shown that they can't be trusted in some cases with firearms to disarm themselves. And what our data shows is that's not good enough. We still have hundreds of people dying at the hands of people who shouldn't have guns.
And that was a message that came through loud and clear in the documentary for me, that what's being done is just simply not good enough. Jennifer, Natalie, Shannon, thank you so much for joining this conversation, and of course for everyone at home for joining us today. And if you or someone you know is experiencing domestic violence, we have some resources up on the screen for you to use. In the US, there is the National Domestic Hotline, and in the UK, there's also a helpline available. Femi will be back next, I believe next week. Yes, don't worry, she'll be back next week with more great